Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Angela Stent. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to the 25th Nava'i-Nalle lecture. This annual lecture, our 25th today, is made possible through a generous gift from the Alfred Friendly Foundation, and I would like to recognize Alfred Friendly Jr. and thank you very much for the support of this lecture series. And the foundation endowed the lecture in honor of the late David Nall. He was executive director of the Alfred Friendly Press Fellowship Program from its founding in 1983 till his retirement in 1992. And I would like very much to welcome warmly Peggy Nall and David Nall. We're very glad that you're with us tonight. And this series, the Nava'i-Nalle Lectures, is intended to foster public and academic interest in Central Asian affairs, and particularly to encourage the work of younger scholars who are entering into this field. And I will now just say a few words about one of the gentlemen for whom this lecture series was named, one Mir Ali Shir Nava'i. He was a Central Asian Turkic poet, writer, politician, linguist, mystic, and painter. And he was the greatest representative of the Chagatai language literature. He's considered by many throughout the Turkic-speaking world to be the founder of early Turkic literature, and he was indeed a Renaissance man. He was born in 1441 in Herat, which of course is now in Afghanistan. He served as a public administrator and advisor to his sultan. He was also a builder who's reported to have founded, restored, or endowed some 370 mosques, madrasas, libraries, hospitals, and other educational and philanthropic and charitable institutions. He was a promoter and patron of scholarship and arts and letters, a musician, a composer, a calligrapher, a painter, a sculptor, and such a celebrated writer and poet that Bernard Lewis, who is of course a renowned historian of the Islamic world, called him the Chaucer of the Turks. And finally now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our lecturer for tonight, Dr. Eric Mcglinchey. He is Associate Professor of Politics and Director of Political Science Graduate Studies at George Mason University School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs. He's the author of Chaos, Violence, Dynasty, Politics and Islam in Central Asia, that came out in 2011. His current book project investigates bilateral and multilateral responses to crises in Eurasia. His most recent article is Fast Forwarding the Brezhnev Years, Orsh in Flames, and there he explores the precursors to southern Kyrgyzstan's 2010 deadly ethnic riots. He received his Ph.D. from Princeton University in 2003, so please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Mcglinchey.
Thank you, Angela, for the very kind introduction. Also, I'd like to thank Ben Loring and Christina for all the work you guys have done in organizing this. Thank you very much for tonight's sponsors. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed hearing about Uzbekistan in the Brezhnev years. It's funny, I try to escape Brezhnev, but Brezhnev keeps following me. The last article I wrote, Brezhnev figures very prominently. And if I recall correctly, Brezhnev got his start in Kazakhstan in the 1960s. And I was very happy to hear that you had a chance of experiencing the Zastoy period with Brezhnev, which I guess is better than the final period with Brezhnev. So. I'd like to just briefly thank you, Angela, for everything that you have done for me. I think I've been here for about 9 years in the DC area, and it really was Angela who introduced me to the policy community in DC. And if it wasn't for your introduction, I wouldn't know many of the people who are here today, and I probably wouldn't have the opportunity to speak about what I'm speaking about today. I have to say I'm a little bit nervous to talk about this topic because I'm talking about work that a lot of you are doing. So I entered this with a little bit of trepidation. But that said, you'll probably be hearing from me, since this is a new project, in the coming months and years. And I would love to hear from you today to see if you think I'm going in the right direction. I'm going to be talking about negotiating crisis in Central Asia. And I mean a couple of things here when it comes to negotiating crisis. I'm just going to set my timer. I know at 7 o'clock, that's when the reception starts, and I don't want to hold anyone from that. I don't want to go over. What I mean by crisis are things like popular uprisings, popular protests, leadership change in Central Asia, not that there's been a lot of that, things like civil wars. So these are the kinds of crises I'd like to look at today. But I also want to, when I say negotiating crisis, that's the United States negotiating crises that exist in Central Asia, but I also have in mind this idea that there is a negotiating crisis within the US government when it comes to Central Asia, that we really haven't done all that well. And I want to give you a flavor about some of the challenges that we've had working in Central Asia for the past 25 years. When I say negotiating crisis, I have in mind that the United States has set out a very clear objective when it comes to working in Central Asia. That objective is, first and foremost, when it comes to politics, first and foremost, this idea of governing justly and democratically. The United States wants to advance, or at least proposes publicly that it wants to advance just and democratic government in Central Asia. If you look back on the past 25 years, if you take a sober assessment of what has happened, the United States has not gone that far in achieving this end result. We've made little headway. So the central question that I'm asking, what I'd like to address is why have we had such limited influence when it comes to negotiating crisis, to getting out of these political quagmires in Central Asia? And what I'd like to do is I'd like to put this in contrast to other cases still in the Eurasian area where there has been some success. Look at that variation. Why the failure in Central Asia? Why some of the success elsewhere? So I'd like to proceed in 6 steps. The first thing that I'd like to do is provide a sense of what Washington, what the executive branch, what the State Department, what USAID believes it's doing when it comes to crisis intervention in Central Asia. Give you an idea of what some of these policymakers are actually saying. So that'll be the first thing. The idea, I would say, of the U.S. State Department, of the executive branch, is perhaps a little bit too rosy when it comes to assessing its own efficacy of dealing with political change or affecting political change in Central Asia. I'd like to contrast this. To some of the work that Moscow has done in the region. Some of the interventions, post-crisis interventions, or maybe creating crisis interventions that Moscow has done in the region for the past, say, 25 years. Next, I'd like to give you a broader overview of the full scope of the kinds of crises this next project is looking at. These are moments in time where I would argue decisive U.S. government intervention, could have changed the course of events in Central Asia. I'm dealing with a counterfactual here. Basically, what I'm propositioning is, if we being the United States government, had intervened more forcefully, perhaps we would have seen different outcomes than the outcomes that we're looking at today. That's a broad overview. I would like to drill down in the next section, in section 4, and look at 3 specific crises, 3 specific missed opportunities in the past 15 years or so. The first one that I'll be looking at is the November 2001 democratic choice movement in Kazakhstan. It's an opposition movement, really the only substantive opposition movement we've seen in Kazakhstan in the post-Soviet period. Look at what the U.S. response was at, what the rhetoric was, and then what the substance was. The next one I want to look at is the March 2005 Kyrgyz quote-unquote tulip revolution, what I call the first putsch in Kyrgyzstan. Again, what the U.S. response was this, perhaps what the U.S. role was in bringing about this revolution and what happened in the months and years following the revolution as far as response after the event. And then lastly, I'd like to look at the April 2010 second Kyrgyz revolution. Again, I think this is probably better described as a putsch, not a revolution. But again, the U.S. role in this, and then the U.S. response following the leadership change. So I'll drill down on those three events. And then, in step 5, I'd like to contrast U.S. engagement in Central Asia with U.S. engagement somewhere else, U.S. engagement in Serbia. This is a case where the United States was involved prior to the 2001 regime change. Or sorry, 2000 regime change, right? Get my dates right. And then very much involved after the regime change. This is a stark contrast to what the United States has done in Central Asia. So I want to put this as a counter case. And this is all by arriving at this last point, which is embracing Central Asia's next crises. There are going to be crises in Central Asia in the coming years. I've been saying this for a while now, but I think we can identify 2 very clear crises coming within the next decade, and that's going to be the crisis of leadership change in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I would posit that these are openings, political openings, where there is space for decisive U.S. intervention, and what we learn from the Serbia-Central Asia contrast can perhaps instruct how the U.S. engages these coming crises. So that's what I propose to do in the next few minutes. Okay. So what about the U.S. objectives in Central Asia? I think for me, one of the most revealing statements, one of the most telling statements of what the U.S. Thought or perceived it can do comes from a statement that George Bush gave in Riga in May 7th, 2005. And this was in response to a question from a reporter, a Western reporter, of the U.S. involvement in the Kyrgyz revolution. There had been a lot of rumors, and I actually think there's some pretty hard evidence that the U.S. was very much engaged in facilitating the protest to Akayev in 2005. And so the reporter put it directly to the president, and this was the president's response. He said, quote, "Freedom is etched in everybody's soul. The idea of countries helping others become free, I would hope, that this would be viewed as not revolutionary, but rational foreign policy, as decent foreign policy, as humane foreign policy." So notice, he's not rejecting the idea that the United States was involved in the Kyrgyz 2005 uprising. I think he's tacitly saying, yes, the United States was involved, and saying we being the United States, had a real effect in this uprising. So there's one take on this. A second take, an old Central Asia hand who's been around for a long time, now in Kazakhstan, Ambassador Kroll. This comes from a statement George Kroll made in early 2010 regarding Kazakhstan and Kazakhstan's potential chairmanship of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And he's articulating this idea that the U.S. will support the Kazakhs' chairmanship of the OSCE on the condition that Kazakhstan continues democratic reform. There's a lot of negotiation in the lead up to the OSCE granting of Kazakhstan the chairmanship. One of the preconditions was this promise to continue liberalization. And Kroll articulates this idea quite well. He says, quote, "Our broader vision is for a strong, independent, and democratic Kazakhstan that is a leader and anchor of stability in the region. We believe Kazakhstan's service as chairman in office for the OSCE will help serve that broader vision." So he's saying tactfully, okay, Kazakhstan, you can be chairman of the OSCE, but you've got obligations here. You have to continue reforming. The United States will support your chairmanship on the condition that you continue reforming. One more statement. Okay. This is from President Obama, October 14th, 2010. The date here is important. This is after the deadly Osh riots, the deadly Jalalabad riots in the summer, after the April uprising that ousted President Bakiyev, who, by the way, had ousted President Akayev 5 years before. This is after what President Obama deemed to be a good election in Kyrgyzstan. And this is what he says about the, quote, historic parliamentary election that happened in early October. He says, quote, through our, that being the United States, through our assistance programs to the Kyrgyz government and civil society, and our, again, our being the United States, there we go. All right. So through our assistance programs to the Kyrgyz government and civil society and our participation in the election monitoring system, I am pleased that the United States has played an active role in facilitating democratic achievement. So this is the U.S. government at the highest level saying, we did this. Our engagement helped bring about these changes. Our engagement helped affect some kind of political reform in Central Asia. So not only is this rhetoric about supporting political reform in Central Asia, this is taking active ownership. Kroll's taking active ownership, Bush is taking active ownership, Obama's taking active ownership, saying U.S. intervention has brought about these things. Let's take a look at the evidence as far as political change in Central Asia. This is Kyrgyzstan's Freedom House score in 1995. Freedom House scores, granted, aren't the best way of measuring what a regime is. You can look at Polity 4, you can look at a whole bunch of different indices. They all tend to follow one another. I think we also have a gut sense of what these regimes are like. What this is saying, we've got a 1 to 7 scale. 1, that's the best. Lower is good in this case. 7, that's the worst. Higher is bad in this case. A score of 4 means partly free. Not quite democratic, not quite Turkmenbashi, right? You know, it's somewhere in between. And so that's Kyrgyzstan in 1994. This is an average of what they look at as political rights and civil liberties. So far, not so bad. Let's take a look at 2015, the most recent scores that just came out. Remember, lower is good, higher is bad. After 2 decades of this kind of engagement with the U.S., Kyrgyzstan hasn't gone in the lower direction, the more democratic direction. Kyrgyzstan has gone in the higher direction, more autocratic direction. Okay, let's take a look at Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, 1995, Freedom House score 5.5. This puts Kazakhstan at the lower bound of autocratic. So again, not quite Turkmenbashi, not Islam Karimov, but definitely not democratic, not partly free, but autocratic. Take a look at the most recent score. I clicked it, you didn't see anything change because nothing's changed. Still autocratic, nothing's happened. I mean, there's a lot that's happened in Kazakhstan, but it's still an autocratic country. Despite Kroll's optimism, right? Despite all this optimism, not much has been changing. And so you might say, well, why am I focusing on Kazakhstan? Why am I focusing on Kyrgyzstan? I'm not focusing on Turkmenistan because, as I told you, I got kicked out, so I can't work in Turkmenistan. I've been kicked out of Uzbekistan, so I can't work on Uzbekistan anymore. But that doesn't matter because these are least likely cases, I would argue, for political change in Central Asia. These are hardened autocracies. I'm focusing on Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan not just because I can still work there, I hope, but because these are places where you can imagine political change. These are the most likely cases in the region. In Kyrgyzstan, we had lots of political openings. I just talked about the 2005 Tulip Revolution, the 2010 overthrow of Bakiyev, the second revolution. These are political openings where one can imagine intervention could have led to political reform. Kazakhstan, this is a wealthy country. Political scientists love to say wealthy countries are the ones that are most likely to become more democratic. Saudi Arabia is a problem, but we'll put that on the back burner. The idea here is that if you've got economic wealth, you're much more likely to liberalize. The other interesting thing about Kazakhstan is the Kazakh political elite desperately wants to be seen as a global elite. It desperately wants to be recognized as in the club. Doesn't want to be seen like the Uzbek elite. Not that the Uzbek elite particularly likes being seen like the Uzbek elite, right? But the point is that the Kazakh elite is championing this image of a greater, more liberal, more inclusive Kazakhstan. There's a buy-in to this kind of ideology. These are the most likely cases. And even in these most likely cases, even after points of political opening, we're not seeing substantive political change. And I want to address why. And you may say, well, maybe, Eric, you're just being naive. Could an outside government actually bring about political change in these kind of countries? Well, actually, outside governments have. Russia, Moscow, the Soviet Union has done this repeatedly. Brief tour through history, I won't go too far. Steve Kotkin would not be impressed. He's my former advisor in grad school. But nonetheless, let me give it a shot. Kazakhstan, the first one. 1986, I don't know if you were still reporting in 1986. These are the December uprising in Kazakhstan. Gorbachev made a pretty bad mistake. He appointed an ethnic Russian as the next first secretary in Kazakhstan, replacing Kunayev, who was incredibly corrupt but also incredibly Kazakh. The Kazakhs weren't particularly happy with Kolbin being appointed first secretary. So there's mass protests in Almaty. The Soviet government intervened, Operation Blizzard, lots of forces came down, quelled everything down, and most importantly, restored political order. Kolbin remained as first secretary, but really only remained in name. Nazarbayev was essentially elevated to be the de facto ruler of the country, or the republic, and in fact, in 1989, he did become the ruler. Outside intervention, you can say, well, this is the Soviet Union. How much of this is outside intervention? Still, I posit outside intervention, restoration of political order. Nazarbayev is still in power today, right? These guys don't go anywhere. Uzbekistan, June 1989, massive political upheaval in the Fergana Valley, in Kokand, Meskhetian Turks and Uzbeks killing each other. Again, Moscow sends troops in, puts down the fighting, puts the blame for the ethnic unrest on the shoulders of the hapless Rafik Nashinov, the first secretary. He becomes the fall guy, and Moscow appoints someone new, Islam Karimov. He's still here. He's still here. The point is, outside intervention can have enduring effects. Moscow's outside intervention in this region has set these two countries on this course of sustained political stability. Take another case. You'll see a dashed line up there. This is a case of non-intervention. Kyrgyzstan, 1990. Riots in southern Kyrgyzstan. These are 2 decades before the riots that we just saw in 2010, but had a very similar kind of dynamic between ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks. Moscow intervenes in the sense that it puts an end to the riots, but what Moscow doesn't do is follow through. Whereas in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Moscow followed through and restored political order to the Kazakh elite and the Uzbek elite, Moscow washed its hands of what was going on in Kyrgyzstan. There was a lot of political unrest. The first secretary, Masaliev, was not reelected as first secretary. They settled on a compromise weak candidate, this guy named Akayev. And Akayev would later be overthrown. It's amazing that he lasted as long as he did. But you have this course of sustained political unrest in Kyrgyzstan because Moscow did not follow through on the intervention. There's reasons behind why Moscow didn't follow through, but it gives you a sense of intervention and the follow-through, and intervention, no follow-through. And you see these enduring effects. So I would posit that actually intervention can have an enduring legacy if done with a lot of resources. You only have to look at Ukraine today. I won't go too much into the Ukraine case, but here is a case of Moscow intervening in the present period, annexation of Crimea, the current support for the rebels in eastern Ukraine, creating, in essence, a weak state. Right? A weak, ineffective Ukraine state, breaking Ukraine off from this growing tendency towards Europe. Again, massive intervention having a very real effect. So maybe you can do intervention. Maybe the intervention is only effective when you're trying to do nefarious things. I don't know. But it's something we can return to later. OK. So I hope I've established this idea that this intervention, this idea of outside intervention is a credible topic that we should be looking at. Okay, now let me just give you a brief overview of the kinds of events that the larger project will be addressing. There's many of these crises in Central Asia over the past 25 years that had the potential for real political openings. Namagan, 1991. This is a case of, in essence, de facto succession of a region from Uzbekistan. There were thousands in the streets protesting Tashkent's rule in November 1991. Tohir Yildash and Juma Namangani, those of you who study Afghanistan may be familiar with these characters, created law and order squads in the cities of in the streets of Namangan. They demanded that the Communist Party offices be turned over for an Islamic center. This is 1991. This is Uzbekistan, 1991, right at the point of collapse. An Islamic center being created, and Karimov bowing to the demands of this population. Unfortunately, for Juma Namangani and Tohir Yildash, the movement was crushed very forcefully in 1992, in March 1992. But we had this moment for potential intervention where something could have changed the course of Uzbek politics. Tajik Civil War, 1992 to 1997. In particular, the 1997 United Nations Broker Peace Treaty. The conditions of this peace treaty were that the opposition, the United Tajik opposition, was to get 30% of the seats in the Tajik government. The Islamic Renaissance Party was accorded legal status. This is the first, and as of today, I think the only place in the former Soviet Union where an Islamic party has legal status. Regrettably, there was no follow-through on the part of the international community. Rahmon has since consolidated power, and Tajikistan is very much autocratic today. May 2005, Andijan, mass protests against the imprisonment of local Muslim businessmen. These protests were violently repressed. I think this narrative is familiar to many of us now. There was a lot of international criticism, but there was no substantive international follow-through. Again, I would posit this was a moment where more sustained intervention potentially could have led to a different course for politics in Uzbekistan. 2011, Janazen, economic protests, oil workers protesting low wages and poor work conditions, a violent clash on Kazakh Independence Day. This was a culmination of 7 months of protests by thousands of workers. The protests were repressed, but again, a moment where more international pressure potentially could have led to changes in the political structure of Kazakhstan. So these are the kinds of crises I'm going to be looking at in the larger project. These are crises in Central Asia. One thing I should note is these are not always perceived as crises here in Washington. So that's, I think, something that we have to pay attention to. The Namangan, 1991, Janazen, 2011, barely registered here. What constitutes a crisis from the view of Central Asians may be very different from what constitutes a crisis from the view of people here in D.C. The other thing that's different is how the arc of crisis is perceived differs. Washington has, I would argue, a focus on the event of crisis itself, the moment of uprising. And I think we saw this very clearly in North Africa, in Egypt, for example. We're fascinated with this actual event, the overthrow of the dictator. But the real crisis often comes after the overthrow. So when I'm talking about crisis here, it's not just the crisis where you have the potential political opening, it's the really deep crisis that follows the political opening. And Central Asians have a very profound understanding of this crisis. I would posit that we here in DC don't have a very deep understanding of this crisis. So these are the kinds of crises I'm looking at broadly. Today, I'd like to focus on just 3. Focus on the November 2001 clash between the democratic choice of Kazakhstan and the regime of Nazarbayev, the March 2005 Tulip Revolution, what I'm calling Kyrgyzstan's first putsch, and then the April 2010 second Kyrgyz Revolution, or what I'm calling Kyrgyzstan's second putsch. In each of these, Moscow actually did have a very keen interest in what was going on. So this is different from what we saw perhaps in Namangan or Janazen. Here, DC really was very much paying attention to what was going on. And DC very much saw the reformist potential of these crises. In all of these crises, regrettably, Washington did very little to help realize the potential for change that would accompany these crises. So let me take a quick look at these three crises. Democratic choice of Kazakhstan. This is a picture of, in the center is Galmjan Jakhiyanov, the Pavlodar Oblast Akim, who is kind of the leader of this. To his right, actually stage right, not his right, to his left is Zhandosov, former vice prime minister, and then stage right is Abyazov, former minister of energy and a very prominent businessman. The biographies here are important. These are oppositionists who came out of the core of the Nazarbayev government. These are oppositionists who came from within the regime. They broke away, splintered away from the government. These people had real power. They had several demands. They wanted increased parliamentary powers in Kazakhstan. They wanted election of local officials, electoral reform, judicial reform, press freedoms. This is the November 18th, 2001 press conference where they're articulating these demands. Again, this isn't a fringe opposition. And more than simply being from within the government, these people had a lot of financial backing. They were supported by millionaires. Abyazov himself was a millionaire. They were supported by billionaires, by people on the Forbes billionaire list. These people had a lot of money. Something could have happened here. The U.S. response, interesting. The U.S. ambassador to the OSCE, in a statement in February 2002, said, the United States believes that democratic pluralism in Kazakhstan has taken a step forward with the establishment of the democratic choice of Kazakhstan. This group is a new peaceful opposition working within the system to push the government to enact reforms outlined by the president. It has been allowed to speak, raise issues, criticize progress, and criticize progress made toward reform through rallies and interviews. So the United States is pretty optimistic about this. The ambassador, Stephen Minikis, goes on to say, quote, we congratulate the government of Kazakhstan on creating political space and openness in which democratic choice has been able to hold rallies and give interviews. So very optimistic. Washington's paying attention. This is a potential for real reform in Kazakhstan. Quickly, this optimism moves to some pessimism. In 2002, the Deputy State Department spokesman says, quote, the U.S. believes that recent developments in Kazakhstan, such as the restrictive legislation regarding political parties, ongoing harassment of opposition figures, pose a serious threat to the country's democratic process. So we're beginning to see frustration with what's going on. People are being thrown in jail, and Washington's not so happy. Lastly, 2003, the State Department issues a fact sheet on Kazakhstan, an almost about face, where the State Department essentially says, well, things are honky-dory again in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, quote, now appears to understand the need to rectify its human rights record. What has Kazakhstan done that demonstrates this recognition that it has to improve? The fact sheet goes on to say that there's been a release of one of the two main imprisoned opposition figures. We now have access to the second one through embassy officers, and there's a new anti-trafficking legislation that's been passed. Basically, what's happened by 2003 is DC has stepped away, is no longer criticizing, and in essence is saying things are back to normal in Kazakhstan, when in reality things weren't back to normal in Kazakhstan. This was a chance to intervene. Did the United States actually do anything to intervene? Here is this is just a tally of the State Department's own reporting of democracy aid. They call this this is the governing justly and democratically line that's reported in the annual fact sheets from the State Department. If you take a look at what's going on, nothing is increasing. There's no uptick in U.S. programming, support for programming for democratization in Kazakhstan during this period. There's rhetoric, there's support from the ambassador, but there's no substantive follow-through as far as actually intervening after this political opening. Rather, what happens is Washington steps back and disengages. So there's no follow-through. We had the crisis, we had the opening, we had the recognition of the opening, but there's no follow-through on the case of D.C. The Kyrgyz cases. Two of them, the 2005 overthrow of Akayev and the 2010 overthrow of Bakiyev. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the events that led up to both of these. I will say that the United States was more optimistic about the 2005 revolution than the 2010 revolution. Much more optimistic about that. To give you a sense of that optimism, on March 25th, at a State Department briefing, the deputy spokesman said, "We will continue to work to support the efforts of the Kyrgyz people as they endeavor to build a stable democracy." I'll show in a second that the supporting didn't come through in the form of any kind of real resources, but it did come through in the form of rhetoric. In 2010, the State Department response was a bit more muted, but nonetheless, Robert Blake, in his testimony before the Helsinki Commission, said, "Our primary foreign policy interest is to facilitate Kyrgyzstan's continued development as a stable democratic state that respects the rights of all of its citizens." So again, there's rhetoric, but there's no follow-through. In fact, if you look at what's going on in Kyrgyzstan during this period, immediately following 2005, there's a market drop-off. There's a market drop-off in the aid that's going for governing justly and democratically, the democracy assistance. At precisely the period where you think there'd be an uptick, Washington's running in the opposite direction. Maybe the job's done, right? I don't know, but the aid doesn't follow. 2010's a little bit more messy. There's a drop-off and then a slight uptick, but not a lot is going on here. Not a lot's going on here. You would think that these are political openings that our government is saying are indeed chances for liberalization. There's no follow-through. There's no follow-through. Let me give you a counter case, the Serbian case. Serbia, is this a comparable case? Well, as far as population, it's a small country, about 7 million people. Kyrgyzstan's got 6 million people. Kazakhstan's got about 17 million people. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are arguably in less hospitable neighborhoods as far as democracy reform. You've got Mongolia, which I suppose is a bright light, but other than Mongolia, there's not much going on as far as neighbors who are going in the democratic direction. Serbia, much better neighborhood. You've got a population in Serbia that is more inclined to look towards the West, to the European Union. There's a sense that there's a potential for joining the European Union. So maybe they're not comparable, right? Maybe, well, of course things should go well in the Serbia case. Well, what's interesting is if you look at the U.S. response to Serbia, just to backtrack a second, you have the overthrow of Milosevic in October 2000. The United States was involved in supporting groups like Otpor in this overthrow, so there was some assistance prior to the overthrow. But take a look at what happens after the overthrow. After the overthrow of Milosevic, democratization assistance goes through the roof. Whereas it's going the opposite direction in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. In Serbia, the response to the U.S. government is the exact opposite. We've had the political opening. Now it's time to get to work. Aid nearly doubled for democracy assistance from 22 million to 40 million between 2000 and 2001. It increased to 70 million in 2003. And you know what the result is. Now, I'm not saying that Serbia became democratic because of U.S. intervention, but I think it's instructive to see how much the United States devoted to Serbia, even though it was in a far better position to become democratic. You would think that the United States would want to devote a lot to Central Asian countries because of their less hospitable position for reform. What you're seeing is something quite different. And if you contrast this, these are aid levels to the three countries on the same axis here. And what you see is, in the Serbian case, it completely dwarfs what the United States government is doing in the Kazakh and Kyrgyz cases. You have the moment of crisis, intervention aid, democracy aid takes off very markedly in Serbia. You have the crises in 2005 and 2010. In 2005 in Kyrgyzstan, aid goes down. 2010 kind of stays the same. And in Kazakhstan, nothing changes at all. So there's very different responses. As an academic, one of the questions that I'm pursuing in the next study is, well, why do we have these different responses? Why would the US government pursue one response in the Serbia case and a completely different response in these Central Asian cases? I'm not quite sure what that is, and I actually welcome some of your thoughts on this. I've got some theories, but I'd welcome hearing what you have to say. But the follow-through in the Serbia case is profound. The follow-through in the Kazakh and Uzbek cases, Kazakh and Kyrgyz cases is almost absent. So I want to leave you with, if I can be so bold, with a policy suggestion. We have two coming crises on the horizon in Central Asia. Nazarbayev is 74, Karimov is 77. There's no doubt that there is going to be, absent heroic techniques like they used on Brezhnev, right? There's no doubt that there's going to be some kind of leadership change in the next five years. And these, I would posit, these periods of leadership change are political openings where decisive intervention on the lines of the Serbia 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003 intervention could have an impact. The Kazakh case is particularly interesting because here you have an independent economic elite that wants change, that's willing to support change. We saw this in 2001. They backed change. These are real chances for the US to intervene and promote substantive political reform after the crisis moment. So I think the lesson learned, what is the lesson learned from this, is rather than retreat after 2005 in Kyrgyzstan, after 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, after 2001 in Kazakhstan, you have to go forward. You have to intervene. You have to provide real programming, or you might as well just get out of the business in the first place. If you look at the levels of aid here in these cases, they're inconsequential. A few $1 million here and there, maybe enough to plant the flag on the ground, but this isn't real. This isn't real democratization policy. This is show. We've got a chance in the coming years to do something substantive, and I think the Serbian case demonstrates that there is real reason to believe that substantive intervention can have lasting and positive effects on the political regimes of these countries. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I will let you field your own questions, but let me just maybe say a couple of words to you. If you want to understand, U.S. actions, I really enjoyed your talk, and it's great. I'm really looking forward to the book. You have to ask, what were the U.S. central preoccupations in Central Asia after 2001, right? And the central preoccupation is obviously the war in Afghanistan, fighting the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic fundamentalism. We have a base in Kyrgyzstan. We don't have one in Kazakhstan, obviously, but we cooperated, as you know, quite closely with the Kazakhs. And so given all those imperatives, right, I mean, of course, we say we support democracy, and we have parts of the government that do, but when you see how difficult it is, these other issues took priority. Serbia, I think, is a very different case, because there, the issues are rather different. The soil is more fertile, as you yourself said. It is, after all, a European country. So I guess the question to you is, how would you make the case, and what do you, and I think then the third thing is that it's obviously very difficult. I mean, how much can the US get involved in this area? I mean, this isn't Russia, which is right next door and has all these close contacts with the elite. How much can it really do to change the situation on the ground? And so I guess my question to you is, in these upcoming successions, what role could the US realistically play in affecting the outcome in what is, in both of these cases, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, a closed system where we're not going to have an opening to affect this situation. Anyway,
yeah. Great. When I made my first timeline where I had the different events, I thought maybe I should put another timeline underneath. actually two different timelines underneath. One would have been up till 1999, 2000. This would have been a timeline reflecting Russian politics and the break with Putin, right? So these are different worlds when we have the break with Putin. Yeltsin, Putin, something big's going on here. The other one would have been the 2001 break, the post 9/11 U.S. foreign policy. I think these are critically important points to make. I gave this a lot of thought in the initial stages of this research. One thing I kept coming back to, if you look at, for example, and you know this firsthand, if you look at State Department statements while Secretary Powell was Secretary Powell, all of the references are, you can't have effective fighting of terrorism without effective human rights and governance. That was the refrain, the constant refrain. Every single State Department statement ended with that. So yes, the interests changed, but the policy, at least the rhetoric, I think remained the same. So at least there was an outward belief expressed by the U.S. government at the time that we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater because of what's going on post 9/11. I think we can question whether or not their rhetoric actually reflected beliefs, but certainly the rhetoric was that we were continue to engage in this. As far as the neighborhood, I think you're right. Serbia is different, but then I keep coming back to the observation: if Serbia is different, why the immense amount of aid in a place where it's most likely to succeed, and the almost absence of aid in the cases that are most difficult? And I actually, I've worked with the people working on democracy promotion in Central Asia since I've arrived, thanks largely, to your introductions. And I take people at their word that they're not doing this as merely window dressing. I remember having conversations with my advisor at Stanford, and then became, went to the NSC and then became ambassador to Russia. People like McFaul believed that there was a potential for this, right? So I think that there was a strong belief that Kyrgyzstan in particular had this potential. And what I continue to be perplexed by is, if there was this strong belief, then why the almost near absence of commitment? But I take your points, and perhaps I maybe the takeaway is, maybe I shouldn't take U.S. government officials so much at their word. But I think your points are very, very well taken. Thank you, Angela. Sure. Yeah.
I'm wondering on your selection of cases. Did you consider the Georgian case or the Ukraine Orange Revolution? Because at least there you'd control for all being former republics of the Soviet Union in an enduring Russian interest. Right. It just seems like Georgia might have been a case with a different result, at least for a while, and I'm wondering if you gave any thought to that case.
Yeah. In 2006, I did a evaluation of NDI, National Democratic Institute, and IRI, International Republican Institute's work in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Serbia. And so Georgia actually was a case that, to me, seemed to be the natural case, maybe more so than Kazakhstan. Georgia is going to be in the broader project. What you find in Georgia, and you can correct me because you probably have greater firsthand knowledge. I know a lot of you who have worked on Georgia have more knowledge than I do. You actually do find a fair amount of intervention in the Georgia case, a fair amount of democratization assistance in the Georgia case. You also find, actually, in the Georgia case, you find European countries being active in this process as well. But you do find, in the Saakashvili period, you do find a fair amount of uptake. We can debate whether or not that yielded substantive changes. I was just there last summer. In some respects, people continue to say that the reforms of the judiciary and the police actually were quite substantive. Georgia continues to look a little bit like Chicago as far as politics are concerned. So, in that sense, maybe there's some way to go. But the intervention, I think, was much more robust and not the Serbia level intervention, but more robust than when we saw in Central Asia. Which then leads me to the academic question. One of the ones that I'm most motivated by: why the variation? Why does Georgia get more attention? Despite having Russia, the big neighbor, so close by, and despite having the breakaway territories, I don't have an answer for that. But Georgia will be part of the next step. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Marlene Laruelle, Central Asia Program GW. Eric, thank you so much for this great presentation. Honestly, it was very provocative for me, and I have two comments. One on the methodological aspect. My impression is that the way you define a crisis is a very Western-centered way of defining what is a crisis for Central Asian countries. If you ask to Central Asians what is a crisis, they would say, well, we are in crisis now. It's not because we are preparing political succession. It's because no more money from Russia, no more remittances, real economic crisis, and so on. So I was wondering how you would take into account what is a local definition of what is a crisis, and you would get a relatively different schedule of, you would have, all the economic crises would be more visible, and the political crisis will be probably less visible if you take into consideration the local perception of what is a crisis. So I was wondering how you could deal with that. Right. And the second one on the policy side, I really think the historical momentum of US promotion of democratic or US engagement in the next political crisis, I think these historical moments are done. They are over. There was a time in the 90s where it was making sense, and that's why I think the comparison with Serbia, for me, it's not working. I think the problem is not who you will be helping in or funding or training. The problem is that the distrust toward the West involvement in the region is so deep. The more the US will be helping some identifiable groups, the less this group will be legitimate. They will be, and you can accuse so-called Russian propaganda and foreign agent and so on, but that the reality is that the distrust is so huge. My impression is that the small groups of people who are fostering, advancing a so-called democratic agenda, the more they will be doing it, the more visibly it will be with foreign money, the less they will be legitimate, and the more, in fact, we are creating a kind of counter-producing effect. So I was wondering if, my impression is that now we have years and years of work in regaining, again, the trust of the kind of big population to make this small group of activists legitimate again. And for me, it's year of work about having more kind of training, educational exchange, but the purely kind of democracy promotion for Central Asia is over because we are delegitimate in the region. Mm-hmm. That's my personal statement, but I would be interested in getting your view on that. Thank you.
Sure. So sometimes these are one of the thoughts that keep me up at night, right? That maybe this is just, let me just pack up and go home, right? And it is, which would be an interesting outcome in of itself, would be somewhat distressing, particularly to, for example, a lot of my Uzbek colleagues who, for a long time, this has been the lifeline, right? This is the U.S. engagement as limited as it has been. This has been the lifeline for a lot of these folk pushing for reform. Distrust. Uzbeks distrust China, right? They really deeply, Central Asians distrust China deeply. In 2005, when the West walked away from Uzbekistan, who came in? China. Came in with a lot of money. Did the intervention prop up the Krymov regime? Well, the Krymov regime probably could have withstood this regardless, but certainly having $500 million suddenly from China didn't hurt. These are narrow political elites that I think can be deeply shaped by partnerships, even with countries that may be distrusted widely among the population. Now, I actually don't think, and I'd like to look at some of the data on this, I don't think that the distrust of the United States is as profound as the media in Central Asia makes it out to be. But again, I think that there's some public survey data that we can look at to gauge this. And so that's an empirical question, one that I certainly hope to look at. As far as crises, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I am very specifically looking at these kinds of political crises that offer openings. It doesn't mean that the 2002 Aksai events in Kyrgyzstan weren't a crisis, right? It doesn't mean that the spilling of cyanide into Issyk wasn't a crisis. It doesn't mean that the 2010 and 2012 events in Tajikistan weren't crises, or the raising of utilities, the cost of utilities in Turkmenistan isn't a crisis. These are crises from the point of view of Central Asians, for sure. But what I'm looking at in this project are these moments in time where there is a window, a critical juncture, where politics is sufficiently unstable, where a large intervention could have an effect. So that I'm very narrowly defining but this does not negate the fact that Central Asians have every right to perceive, a 30% hike in the price of electricity as a crisis. Yeah.
I'm Nava'i Nalle from the Voice of America. It's always very interesting, fun to listen to you. I'm going to continue on what Marlene started. You know that the United States seems pretty comfortable working with Nazarbayev and Karimov. They know who they are. They know enough about their political strategic maneuvering. They don't seem to be very surprised with the decisions in Tashkent and Astana. And come April, re-elected Karimov, they'll probably continue working with them, and U.S. officials tell us that we will work with no matter who's in power in these capitals. So what could happen for them to change that policy? I mean, what kind of crisis are we talking about? Karimov will probably be re-elected. And, unless something major happens in Uzbekistan, we'll probably continue. I mean, I know I'm being sort of a defeatist here, but what could happen?
So what's going to happen to Karimov is he's going to die.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. And I don't mean to be flippant, but that is the political opening.
So it's not the fact that he'll be re-elected, it's the fact that he'll eventually die.
Yes. And so, I think the question is, does the crisis come before he dies? That is, he's too frail. I mean, are they going to roll him out on a dolly and shock him like they did with Brezhnev? Or is he going to step from power or be removed from power? And I think the frailer these people become, the less likely they're going to hold. So there will be a crisis. I'm less sanguine, by the way, about the Uzbek case. Uzbekistan doesn't have what Kazakhstan has. Kazakhstan has an independent economic elite. This independent elite, and to bring in some political science theory, right? These are the kinds of people who, because they perceive their assets to be vulnerable, would actually prefer rule of law. In Uzbekistan, if you look at who's wealthy in Uzbekistan, the people in Uzbekistan who have wealth by dint of their relationship to the state. And they would like to see a perpetuation of the kind of system that gives them the rents from the state. That's not what we see in Uzbekistan. So I share your defeatism for Uzbekistan, not because I don't think there'll be a political opening. I know there'll be a political opening. But I share your defeatism in the sense that the underlying domestic situation in Uzbekistan doesn't have the key component that Kazakhstan has, which is this independent economic elite. And in that sense, I think one would have to seriously question the kind of intervention, given that the uphill struggle is much more in Uzbekistan. Yeah.
Farukh Arnazarov, GW Fellow. That was a very interesting speech indeed. I'm not very much convinced on the Serbian case, and the success word is a kind of, but I have so many comments. I try to narrow down and basically put this into context. First of all, with the crisis, why do you think that in Kazakhstan, even after those presidents die, that there will be crisis. Maybe they will follow the Turkmen case, where everyone actually expected that it would be crisis, like, you know, some elites will be like fighting with each other, but it was so smooth, and so we actually, as if nothing happened. So what gives you enough evidence to claim that something like a true crisis may happen? Another thing, I don't really agree with the independent Kazakhstan, non-independent Uzbekistan economic-wise, because if you look at the economic sustainability, then basically Kazakh economy is heavily dependent on the oil revenues, and whereas Uzbekistan tries to diversify its economy, and if you look like they promote manufacturing and things like that. So I don't know what kind of independence you are talking about in that case. So, and my question is, going to United States, connecting the building a bridge, that basically how you think, taking into account that in some crises United States actively takes into account, in some it just doesn't, does it have enough capacity to basically immediately react to that and launch some programs, but I'm afraid not democratic programs because they're not going to work in this region?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me take the Kazakh oil issue first. You are right in that a large portion of the Kazakh economy depends on oil. If you look at Kazakh wealthy elites, though, a lot of them have their wealth not from oil, but from other resources. Vladimir Kim, he doesn't need oil. He's a billionaire, right? There's a lot of Vladimir Kims out there who are not tied to the oil industry, who have the potential to play hugely important roles after Nazarbayev departs the scene. You know, I take your point that oil is a source of a lot of this wealth, but there are immense amount of wealth in Kazakhstan that are not linked to oil. And these economic elites do have an interest in trying to legitimize their wealth, right? And a rule of law system may be one way to do that. Why not, you know, Kazakhstan following the Turkmen case? I still don't understand the Turkmen case. I don't think the Turkmen understand the Turkmen case. One of the reasons why I think Kazakhstan is going to be different is if you look at you know, someone like Ertisbayev, right, the Главный помощник президента. Every couple months, this guy is coming up with some harebrained scheme for succession in Kazakhstan. He's floating these ideas of how we're going to select the next leader, and I assume that this is with the approval of Nazarbayev, and I think there's a real concern about the mechanism, how this is going to be affected. There's always these trial balloons. They see how they settle, and then they walk away from them. So I think, yeah, you're right. There could be a kind of a Turkmen case, but I also think that there could also be, you know, it could be something much more akin to the fumbled Egypt case, the Mubarak case, right? There's no dynastic succession. There's no clear in Kazakhstan. There's no clear next ruler. There's no mechanism. So I think it's going to be difficult, and the Kazakhs are already trying to do that, and they're not doing a particularly good job of trying to find this mechanism. So I think there is a potential here. As far as U.S. capacity, I mean, your point here is. The
point is, since U.S. withdrew from the region,
right.
All the funding and everything they cut, so do they have enough capacity to, for example, if some crisis occur again, to find these funds and basically again jump into the region, which they are not interested in?
Well, I would dispute the claim that the United States is not interested in the region. Now, I know I'm biased because I love Central Asia, right? I think there's a lot of interest in Central Asia, and even more interest in Central Asia today because of what's going on in Ukraine. There's a fear that it may be unjustified, but there's a potential for Russia exerting influence in this area. This is a critical area, remains a critical area for U.S. operations in Afghanistan, which now look like they're ramping up again. So I think that there's a strategic interest, and with that strategic interest, I think there comes an interest in the politics of these governments. At the very least, keeping them amenable to having military partnerships. But we're not talking a lot of money here. $70 million in the Serbia case, in the big scheme of things, that's not a lot of money. What would $70 million do in Kyrgyzstan compared to the 12 million, 13 million that the U.S. has extended in the past? I think it would do a lot. I won't name the opposition figure, but every 4 years he'll come to me in Bishkek and say, Eric, for $4 or $5 million, we could change this. Talk to your friends in Washington. We can change the situation. So I mean, we're not. He may be overly optimistic, but I think a lot can be done with not a huge amount of resources. So, yeah, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nazik Muradov. I'm from Central Asian program at GW. And my question is about Moscow's intervention into installing regimes in Central Asia and their duration. So you've mentioned that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan had their leaders installed, and then because that didn't happen in Kyrgyzstan, so that's why Akayev kind of didn't last. So my question is, don't you think that it's rather because they didn't have enough economic resources and capacities to distribute, rather than they didn't have like a strong Moscow's hand backing up their leader? Because as far as I know, Akayev received lots of foreign help, especially democratization aid from Western countries. But because, did you consider the fact that maybe because the resources weren't redistributed in the country, that's why he didn't last for too long? Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is something that in an earlier project I looked at a lot. So the first thing to keep in mind here with Akayev is the Kyrgyz political elite fragmented in 1990. It's much more difficult to maintain control over a fragmented political elite than over a political elite like the political elite that Nazarbayev and Krymov had. If you have a large party and anybody in that inner circle knows that they can be easily replaced by someone else, they're much more likely to be loyal to the leader. So there was an element of instability that this 1990 moment created. The role of economics is critical. Democratization aid is interesting. If you give aid for political party promotion, or humanitarian aid for that region, or health aid, or education aid, this aid doesn't go directly, well, it does. It goes to the executive branch, but it's distributed through ministries. So the education ministry, the health ministry, all these different ministries. And what you find is, Akayev is using this money for patronage, but he can't capture it all. And that actually is what kept him in power until 2005. Well, until 2001, that's the main operating principle until 2001. So the nature of democratization aid actually helped counteract the instability that was inherent in the Kyrgyz system. 2001, and this is where Angela's point I think is spot on, 2001, the balance of money coming into Kyrgyzstan shifts from democratization, humanitarian aid, to manas, to fuel contracts, to things that you could capture directly. The presidential family could capture the rents from this directly. And guess what? They stopped sharing this with the political elite in Kyrgyzstan. The political elite got upset, and then you saw the overthrow in 2005. So you're right in the nature of economic aid. Economic aid propped up Akayev until 2001, and then the avarice of the central government after 2001, then when the base rent started coming in, led to the downfall. And I would say the same thing with Bakiyev post-2005. Thanks. Yeah. Sure.
Mr. McGlinchey, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. Daniel Potts, School of Foreign Service. Quick question. So I understand clearly Russia's shadow looms larger in the area, but China is certainly interested. They've developed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In Beijing, China is well familiar with dynastic succession. How will the SCO, how will Beijing respond with the death of a leadership in Kazakhstan or elsewhere?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the 2005 Uzbek response, I think, caught a lot of us off guard. I mean, the one thing that's clear is if you compare financial inflows to the region, Russian financial inflows, U.S. financial inflows, and Chinese financial inflows, one is different from the others, right? And that's China. The amount of money that's coming in from China is huge. If you look to Africa for guidance, what we find in Africa is there's a lot of investment, but there's a reluctance to affect regime change and to meddle in that sense. So my guess is that China will be very interested in perceiving or in securing its economic interests, but not so interested, in contrast to Moscow and the United States, in meddling in the politics of these places. Yeah. Yes, please.
My name is Danny Woods. I'm a junior in the SFS. How do you think that the formation of Russia's new economic union, however questionable it may seem, and the fact that it's been courting Central Asian republics to join, factors into the American foreign policy approach in the region?
Factors into the U.S. policy towards the region, yeah. I was in Georgia this summer when they had the meeting, where they signed, the presidents of Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan signed the accord. And Nazarbayev looked so pained. He looked so uncomfortable at this meeting. I get the sense that the Central Asians aren't particularly keen on this union. I don't know. Others may dispute that. The Central Asian business folk I know aren't particularly keen on the union. Can the U.S. use this to its advantage? Well, one, I don't necessarily see Moscow or U.S. as zero-sum in Central Asia. I think there's certainly points of cooperation. But right now, I'm not particularly convinced by the union and how it's going to roll out. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Central Asian countries trying to limit the effect of the union, either by overtly trying to get out or just by doing what they always do and just not paying attention to it. I mean, if you look at Central Asian, the gray economy in Central Asia, this stuff goes on all the time, and agreements with things like this union would be routinely ignored. So I think you might see that as well. So how's it going to affect U.S. policy? To the extent that it might not be much of a union in the first place, I don't see much of a profound influence on U.S. foreign policy. So. Yeah, okay, sure. David, I can talk to you anytime. I think. I don't know, you might not want to talk to me anymore. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Hi, Dina Schulk. I'm a master's student here. A few comments. First, I would say look at Moldova after their revolution as an example. I would say Serbia is not a good example simply because you had UNMIK, you had Mahdi Ahtisaari leading the way. It was a coordinated effort. It was Mrs. Madeline's war. I mean, there was clearly political and organizational and significant financial backing into that. So it's like apples and oranges. Moldova might be a slightly better case. I'd also say democratization in general, it's NGO promotion and NGO assistance, and these NGOs work in very difficult environments, and I've done a lot of personal work with NGOs in Kazakhstan, and I mean, as an American, we've gotten KNB threats. So I would say that, yeah, you can empower the little guy, but at the same time, there's still the power of the state and the Siloviki, which is not really talked about, but it is important. And I would strongly disagree with you that there is independent financial power and independent economic elites in Kazakhstan, in that you can't just define wealth as oil in that country, because there's uranium, there's gold, there's Kazakh mis, Samarkazin, 80% of the economy. Anyone who has a business up to $2 million, sure, they might have it, their own business, but any way to scale, you need accretion. And from my interviews and my research with people, it's not going to be explicit, and it's not a clear correlation the way it is in Russia, but certainly there is accretion, the wealth is tied to the states, and certainly, yeah, elites in theory would like to be able to make their own money, but there is absolutely that necessity, and there's a tacit acceptance of that. And anyone who has Vladimir Kim or Utambayev, who just consolidated the top 3 banks during Summer Khazina's resale of the state-owned banks that they purchased during the 2008 nationalization of banks in December, all this is done through a very centralized process, very much Krisha, very much elite. The Adai elite basically control the Caspian wealth region. These relationships aren't explicit, but they're there. So there is the Krisha necessary. So I would say that independent wealth does not necessarily exist. And anyone like Vladimir Kim, they all already have their second visa or green card already worked out as their exit. So those guys are fine once Nazarbayev goes. It's really the little guys. And I would say now, I mean, you have the elections in March and then the elections in April. Who's going to be the opponent? The same Ecology Party guy who's run the past 3 times. I forgot his name. He gets like 1%. But I think at the end of the day, there has to be a fundamental realization that we're not necessarily going to make a big impact helping NGOs. The state has, whether it's not explicit, the state does have a significant reach. And for most elites, there is an interest for them to maintain these elite connections because it's a matter of self-preservation, and sometimes it could be their lives. And then finally, I would say one more thing to say. Now I forgot. This happens. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Really good points. I appreciate it. Thanks for your recommendation of Moldova. Again, I'm in the early stages of this project, and that should be that'll be in there. Let me just address your last point. The state is not a uniform entity, and the democratic choice of Kazakhstan wasn't accidental in this presentation. These were elites who were the state, right? Prime Minister, right? Vice Prime Minister, Pavlodar Oblast, foreign Minister of Energy. What happens again and again and again in these periods of political opening is you get people who peel off, right? You get people who peel off from the state in quotation marks. So what I'm talking about in the Kazakh case is the wealth that exists and the wealth that is held in such a profoundly different way in Kazakhstan than it is in Uzbekistan. And people like him, people like Abyazov, have an interest for establishing a different kind of Krisha. And that Krisha could be rule of law. And they tried in 2001. And I think we could see a similar kind of process with the crisis that's going to surround the leadership change. So you're right that there's a connection to the state, but in Kazakhstan you get people peeling off from the state again and again and again. You don't get that in Uzbekistan, and I think that's a fundamental point to keep in mind.
Well, you can see you've provoked a fantastic debate here. We could go on. I suggest that we now repair to the reception where we can continue the discussion, and please join me in thanking Eric Mcglinchey for a terrific talk. Really, thank you. That was great.